event flyer is a perennial issue in that country, perhaps not least because the national newspapers tend to publish polls on the Constitution every year. A recent one came out in the Yomiuri Shimbun, I think it was on the 15th of September, which noted that support for constitutional revision was slightly ahead of opposition for constitutional revision, 43% to 39%, I believe the figures were. When we look at Article 9, however, which is, of course, the Constitution's war-announcing clause, the picture is a little different. About a third of Japanese favor revision of Article 9. About half, though, favor some kind of reinterpretation to Article 9 in order to allow Japan to participate in international cooperation. So today we're going to talk about both aspects of constitutional change, revision, reinterpretation. We're going to look at things from a historical perspective, sociological perspective, legal perspective, political perspective. And to do that, we've assembled a stellar cast. Thomas Berger is Associate Professor of International Relations at Boston University. He's responsible for what is regarded as a landmark work in the field of IR on how culture affects the construction of national military policy. That's Cultures of Anti-Militarism is the title of that work. He's also more recently the co-editor of Japan and International Politics, Beyond the Reactive State. Chris Hughes, he might disagree with me, but I think he's Britain's foremost scholar on military issues in Japan. He's the Professor of International Politics and Japanese Studies at the University of Warwick. He's held a number of visiting research positions at Tokyo University, Harvard University, and he is the author of Japan's Security Agenda, Military, Economic, and Environmental Dimensions. Craig Martin is an Associate Professor of Law at Washburn University. He's a regular contributor to the Japan Times on constitutional issues. His PhD at the Osaka University Graduate School of Law and Politics, which was right next to my old department, was on constitutional or international law constraints on the use of force and constitutional restraints on the use of force. And Sabine Frühstück is Chair and Professor of Modern Japanese Cultural Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's also held a number of visiting research positions at places like Berkeley, Stanford, Kyoto University, and the International Research Center for Cultural Studies in Vienna. And in the course of researching one of her recent books, Uneasy Warriors, she became the first scholar to participate in basic training with Japan's self-defense forces and interview SDF members on bases and examine how the forces try to shape its international environment in modern-day Japan. So without further ado, I'll pass things over to Tom.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to begin with some thanks and then a confession. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is actually the third time I've come to the Wilson Center, and I've always enjoyed it immensely. Now I also have to make a confession. This particular topic, constitutional revision, is one which I've always been interested in. I've always known as terribly important, something I really should focus on. And yet, nonetheless, I've always tried to kind of avoid. Because, frankly, the kind of tortured logic of the whole constitutional debate just confused me and frightened me. That there are certain things like nuclear weapons, which are, in fact, for defensive purposes, constitutional but illegal, seemed odd. Even stranger is that there are other things, like the right to participate in collective defense organizations, which are legal, but the exercise of which is unconstitutional. So I really tried to avoid this stuff as much as possible. but it keeps on popping up over the course of my life, including again today. Thanks,
Sorry.
Bryce. Yeah, right. Now I'm going to get a little agitated. And I've always felt, frankly, a bit guilty. This is something I really should look a bit at more and not be so afraid of. Now, constitutional revision and me. When I began my dissertation work back in the 1980s, the issue was in the air. Prime Minister Nakasone had been raising the issue for a while, but then he dropped it to pursue perhaps even less productive issues, such as the visit to Yasukuni. There was a powerful movement of Japanese LDP politicians led by Okuno Keisuke, who were pushing it. It was there, but I tried to avoid it. And in the early 1990s, after I had written my dissertation, the Cold War ended, public support for constitutional revision increased. You'd look at the public opinion polls, whereas in the 1980s, 50, 60, 65% at the height opposed constitutional revision. Then slowly a plurality began to appear who were supporting it. At the same time, various influential politicians, most notably Ozawa Ichiro, who was once again an influential politician, was pushing it in his blueprints for the reform of Japan. And, I'd just written a book, or I was writing a book in which I was saying, Japan is not going to change. Here was this thing. So again, defensive avoidance. I tried to look away, crossed my fingers, and I was lucky. Then in the year 2000, I was teaching at Johns Hopkins near here. I was asked by some people in the U.S. government to actually talk about this subject. Okay, now I had to confront my fears with a group of actually very knowledgeable government and analysts. And boy, I'm in trouble. And once again, there were reasons for why the topic was there. Opinion polls showed that, again, support for the Constitution had increased. The major Japanese parties at the time, the LDP, the Komeito, Buddhist Komeito, Clean Government Party, and the Democratic Party of Japan had agreed to set up committees for the first time. Formally, you had committees to actually investigate and produce a report, proposals for constitutional revision. And it seemed like this was a really hot topic again. Now, by this point in time, my book was finished, and I was on my way to tenure, so I relaxed a little bit. I went and gave my talk. I'd been talking to a number of people, and I had to caution that I thought the road ahead was going to be rocky, but I wasn't sure about it, and then I moved ahead onto other research topics, working on the history issue, which is something I've just finished writing a book on now. All right, 2005, 2007, I thought my goose was cooked. Various experts who I knew and respected, including Richard Samuels, Eldridge, and others, were suggesting that now we're just at the brink of a breakthrough. Opinion polls had gone up. Again, support had gone up even further for revision. All sorts of previously defense taboos, which had been viewed as being inviolable, had been broken. And so it seemed it was finally going to happen under the Abe Shinzo government. And then, to my surprise, and I must admit sort of secret relief, it didn't work again. Yeah? And so when I look back on this history, and so I was a little bit perplexed by what to do when Bryce asked me to come and talk about the latest initiative, the Maehara government, and I think some others may talk a little bit more about that, but not Maehara government, but there has been an initiative in the Maehara, under Maehara to take a look at this issue again. I was a little bit perplexed about how I should handle this phobia of mine. And I was actually tempted to invoke the old engineering joke about nuclear fusion. Engineers engineers like to say that nuclear fusion is the power source of the future and always will be. It seems like constitutional reform is the next big issue in Japanese politics and always will be. But I know better than to allow my personal neurosis to substitute for analysis. And so I decided to really finally overcome my fears and try to look at this issue as objectively as I can. And I must say that, again, when I go through this exercise, I've come to the conclusion that there continue to be significant obstacles to reform. But nonetheless, there are certain things which have changed, and I think it is going to be possible in the medium term or longer term future, 5-10 years or so, for there to be an actual genuine shift in this. But there's no guarantees. Now let me explain to why I've come to this conclusion by looking first at what I see as being the primary obstacles to constitutional reform in the past, and how I see that they have come to change and have not changed in certain ways in the past. Now, again, I'm going to have to make a little apology to Bryce Wakefield. He had this sort of, we didn't talk this through between ourselves, but I think his division of labor was I should focus on ideological variables. But I am, for those of you who are sort of IR cognoscenti, I am what is known as a thin constructivist. That is, I believe that you cannot look at ideology alone, that you cannot make sense of the way in which institutions and international structural forces like the balance of power or economic interests function without looking at ideological variables. But at the same time, I believe that ideological variables are profoundly influenced by these other more concrete forces. So I actually think you have to take a look at them to some extent together. Now, if you take a look at sort of the history of Japanese efforts to deal with constitutional reform, there are sort of three sets of factors which stand out as having really hindered reform in the past. One is international political, one is ideological, and sort of political, cultural, if you like, and the third one is sort of institutional, political institutional. I'll speak a little bit more briefly about, I'll focus more on the ideological issue, but let me begin with the international issue. Japan historically has been fearful of entrapment, of being pulled into conflicts in which it, through its alliance with the United States, in which it really had no national interest. While the Cold War in Europe may have been a Cold War, in fact, in the immediate vicinity of Japan, the Cold War was quite hot. We had lots of conflicts and potential conflicts, and the United States would have very much liked to Asianize the Cold War in Asia and have Japan bear more of that burden. Now, Japanese political leaders, for obvious reasons, did not want to get involved in that game. And from the time of Yoshida Shigeru, the Japanese prime minister of in the 1950s, who presided over, in many ways, the sort of crucial formative moment in the construction of the Japanese national security system, was delighted to use Article 9 as a way of fending off American demands for more burden sharing. This already happened at the time of the outbreak of the Korean War. It continued throughout the 1950s, and time again, American political leaders, including Richard Nixon, vice president, 1950s, in the Eisenhower administration, coming to Japan saying, "You remember that Article 9 thing? Big mistake. Let's move on." And it must have been absolutely a delicious irony. I mean, Yoshida and his successors really must have enjoyed using Article 9 in order to, turn back American demands. I mean, it's so wonderful. We love you so much. You guys made us what we are today, and therefore we cannot help you. I mean, a brilliant stroke. So, Article 9 was useful as an instrument for avoiding burden sharing. Now, this alone, however, would not by any means explain the particular kinds of choices which Japan made, either in defense or on constitutional revision. And I think the other important underlying factor was that the Japanese political system during the Cold War was highly polarized. There was deep ideological divisions which translated into deep political divisions, which made it very, very difficult to push this issue forward. Roughly speaking, and I'm hardly alone in this particular kind of presenting this particular kind of typology, you could talk about three groups in the Japanese debate over the constitution, over Japanese politics in general. On the one hand, it was a loud and vocal and quite influential conservative nationalist spectrum of opinion who viewed the constitution as basically an alien imposition, an artificial institution which had been imposed upon Japan against its will, and there was a lot of historical evidence for this, and which in fact helped constrain and paralyze Japan until Japan produced its own constitution based upon its own understanding of its interests and its traditions. Japan could not truly become a nation and could not truly develop the kind of sense of national pride and confidence that they felt was absolutely necessary for Japan as a country. Against them, and for them, Article 9 in particular was a centerpiece of what they wanted to get rid of. It was a mechanism which debilitated Japan in the international security realm, but it was by no means the only thing in which they wanted to change. They also wanted to change the status of the emperor. They wanted to bring in a list of duties as well as rights into the Japanese constitution, and so forth. Now, against them was arrayed a powerful coalition of you could call idealistic progressive forces, left idealists, or whatever term you want to use, who basically liked the Constitution, weren't perfectly happy, but liked the Constitution, preferred the Constitution as it was, and were deeply opposed to any type of constitutional reform. They, in particular, held up Article 9 as sort of the centerpiece of a particular kind of national identity, which they thought Japan should take over. Japan as a peace nation, Heiwa Kokka Nippon kind of idea. And they were very afraid that if you opened up the possibility for constitutional reform, that the conservative political forces who seemed to be in a dominant position in government, in the bureaucracy, and in the ruling Conservative Party would hijack the reform process in order to basically undermine post-war democracy, to remilitarize Japan and create a much more authoritarian political system. Sometimes when I talk to my classes, it seemed like the Japanese of those days sort of viewed democracy as a kind of beautiful foreign alien flower, kind of American beauty, which had been transplanted into the alien soil of Japan and was doing okay, but if you screwed up with the water, if you played around with the conditions, in any way the thing might just wither and die. So they were against that. Now, between these two sort of polar opposites, there was a sort of broad spectrum of centrist opinion, with all sorts of different groups who were probably in principle open to some type of pragmatic reform of the Constitution, but who were opposed to a complete revision. They would have liked to have made more pragmatic reforms. But like the left, they were worried about, even while the conservatives in the 1950s, from the mid-1950s on, were aligned politically with the nationalists, they were concerned that if the nationalists were in a position to impose their particular vision of Japan, that they might actually succeed. And they were also very concerned about what they feared was the tendency of the Japanese people to follow with their political leaders. A kind of shudan kodosei, collectivism of the Japanese population, which, once you let the genie out of the bottle, it would be very dangerous. You start with constitutional reform, then you join a sort of global anti-communist alliance. You slip in a little bit of emperor worship, and before you know it, next thing you find yourself bombing Shanghai, kind of thing. So, this kind of this kind of calculation, this constellation of interests led to the situation where again and again, whenever you had the conservatives seeming to be moving forward and implementing their agenda, including on constitutional reform and other issues, especially defense issues, but also education, historical issues, and so forth, the centrists tended to defect and de facto cooperate with the progressives to undermine these kinds of projects. You saw this again and again. You saw it most notably in 1960 with the Kishi government. You saw it again later on with Nakasone, with the 1% barrier. You would see it again later on in Japanese history as well. Now, beyond this sort of polarization of politics, there was also a political system, a particular structure of institutions which made constitutional reform very difficult. To begin with, and I'm sure Craig will say something a little bit more, but I mean the sort of legal requirements to actually implement constitutional reform are extremely high. Though other countries have had similarly high barriers and been able to reform it, Japan is alone in being immutable, having a constitution which is as immutable as it is. But in addition to these sort of formal institutions, just as important is sort of the informal structure of Japanese politics. While the Liberal Democratic Party was in control of Japanese politics, the old saw was the Liberal Democratic was not very liberal, it was not very democratic, and wasn't very much of a party. It was highly factionalized. There was a constant maneuver of sometimes hostile political personalities, even ones like Nakasone and Fukuda, both of whom were perhaps closer to the sort of nationalist spectrum of opinion, but who would on concrete issues whenever a controversial position or issue rose, quite ready to utilize those differences for their own political gain. And when you put these three factors together, this fear of free riding, this polarized domestic political ideological climate, and this frankly very unwieldy political system, it was basically constitutional reform throughout the Cold War was what the Japanese like to call mission impossible. Now, this began to change after the end of the Cold War, and certain things changed quite significantly. In terms of international politics, while Japan was not eager to join into international security arrangements, pressures mounted, and Japan was forced to alter its interpretation of what it could be permitted to do constitutionally and not. The Japanese public actually saw that you could safely participate in peacekeeping operations and provide a certain amount of offshore support for U.S. operations without the military running amok. So there was an important shift on that score. Ideologically, I would say, and this I'll focus a little bit more on, there was a general depolarization of Japanese politics. That is, the extremes between the left and the right, which had so much characterized post-1945 politics, declined. That did not mean that you created a consensus or a common point of view, but you saw a kind of shift of opinion to the center. This reflected itself in a number of ways, in the way Japanese party system was set up. The old left, the progressive left parties, concentrated in the Japanese Socialist Party and Japanese Communist Party, declined, in the Japanese Socialist Party's case, quite precipitously. Also, quite importantly, there was a kind of moderation on the right. The old nationalists, the sort of Genda Minoru types, for those of you who know that time period, largely disappeared from the political scene. Not completely, but largely. And you saw this reflected in a number of different ways. For example, Chris Winkler has done a very good sort of content analysis of different kinds of constitutional reforms, proposals for constitutional reforms, comparing the 1950s and 60s with the 1980s and 90s into the early part of the 2000s, the noughties, as they're sometimes called. And you saw that the kinds of proposals which were coming are much more moderate. There was a decline in sort of more reactionary positions, more sort of nationalist positions on constitutional reform, and likewise a slight decline in the number of progressive reforms, proposals for reform. So on the whole, Japanese constitutional reform proposals of the recent decades have been much more centrist, to use the terminology I'm using here, in terms of their orientation, looking for sort of pragmatic reforms of the Japanese constitution without a sort of fundamental transformation of the Japanese political system. I think you also saw this in terms of an increased confidence on the part of the Japanese in their own political system, which manifested itself in various ways, some of which I'm going to put aside, so I leave room for my colleagues to chat a little bit more about. But in general, this increased confidence in Japanese democracy, this depolarization of Japanese democracy, allowed for a greater debate, a greater readiness. And beginning actually in the early 1990s through to today, you've seen an increase in the Japanese population's readiness to accept constitutional revision in principle. Yeah? Going up to 40 and sometimes over by the early part of the 21st century, over 50%. So this was, again, a change. Political process, there were some efforts to streamline the decision-making process, some efforts already in the LDP period, notably under Koizumi, to get away from the factional politics system, and there was some success at that. Skilled political leaders like Koizumi was able to accomplish a lot. And also, by the way, and I'm sure, again, Craig will talk about this, there was some clarification of how the revision process of the Constitution would actually look like. And because of this combination of factors, a lot of analysts, again, in recent years, the last 10 years, came to the conclusion that, there's been a fundamental shift in the international environment, a fundamental shift in Japanese domestic politics. There are powerful reasons why Japan should begin to think more seriously about constitutional reform, and therefore it's going to happen very soon. However, there are certain things which have not changed. So let me talk a little bit about what has not changed so much. First of all, there continues to be a fear of entanglement and entrapment. Again, if you take a look at public opinion polls, Paul Midford has done a number of good studies, by the way, which I would recommend, Willem Vos in Tokyo as well, which shows that there is a great deal of distrust of the United States. Even while there's a high level of support for the U.S., U.S.-Japanese alliance in the public, there's also kind of a feeling of shikataganai. There's, faute de mieux, to use another foreign term. There's nothing better for it. We have no other choice but to go with this. And the United States cannot entirely be trusted, even if the United States' intentions are good. As you could see in the context of the war on terror, especially the occupation of Iraq, the United States has a real talent for getting itself and its allies into situations which are rather messy. And the Japanese public noticed this. While there was a depolarization of the Japanese political system, the Japanese system still has a lot of different views. It's a highly disunified point of view, including a wide range of opinions about what kind of constitutional reform. While everyone, there's a general support for constitutional reform, there is considerable disagreement about what constitutional reform would actually mean. The Japanese phrase would be soron sansei kakuron hantai. Everyone agrees in the general, but in each particular instance there's a disagreement. The Asahi newspaper, for example, in May 2005, did a sort of list of reasons why, they asked why the people who were interested in the constitutional reform wanted it. And the answer was a broad range of different issues. So, number one reason for, we want a broader range of rights for individuals, things like right to privacy, right to a healthy environment, so forth. Another popular answer, I don't have time to go through it, wanted well, that was the biggest group. Others wanted to just change the constitution because it's never been changed. It's kind of an oddity that Japan should overcome. Actually, changing Article 9 and in order to allow Japan to undertake larger military operations, very low on the list. Only 9% of those who supported constitutional reform picked that particular reform as a reason for doing it. So again, you had a broad spectrum of views. And there also tended to continue to be an allergic reaction on the part of the Japanese political system to sort of overt displays of nationalism, strong, more traditional nationalism on the part of its leaders. And then finally, I would say the Japanese political process has continued to be quite unwieldy. I mean, while the old factional system of the Tanaka Kakue kind of era has gone, once again, as we saw in the last DPJ electoral selection of the prime minister, factions continue to play a role. In some ways, we've gone back to the old faction system, which existed perhaps in the 1950s and 60s. And again, this can makes it very difficult to exercise leadership. These different factors, this fear of entanglement, this unity of opinion, allergy to sort of nationalism, this fractious political system came together in a devastating way the last time a Japanese political leader, Abe Shinzo, pushed the constitutional reform issue in 2007. Abe really made this a centerpiece of his prime ministership, and he was really quite badly punished by the upper house elections in the summer of 2007. Now, there were a variety of reasons for why that happened beyond the defense issue, but I think the defense issue, what it did above all else, caused mobilization. I think Sabina will talk about it on the grassroots level against him. But more importantly, it made Abe seem to be out of touch with the issues which the Japanese voters really were concerned about. Number one issues were things like pensions and health reform. Constitutional revision, upgrading the U.S.-Japanese Defense Alliance, this just did not answer the needs of the constituents as the constituents themselves saw it. And this led to a disaster. Now, prospects for the future, well, I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the extent to which things have changed. And I think if you have a push for constitutional revision under the right conditions, that is, if you link it with a moderate reform program, if you emphasize not upgrading the sort of global aspect of U.S.-Japanese alliance, but if you emphasize instead the territorial defense of Japan, and I think the Japanese populace very strongly supports the defense of the Japanese nation as a whole. It should be possible at some point to push through. In some ways, the DPJ has an advantage in dealing with this issue, since they cannot be viewed in the same way as, let's say, Abe Shinzo or some of his conservative LDP predecessors, to be a sort of nationalist of the old sort. I mean, Maehara and Aki Nagashima, who I've met and are perfectly nice guys, and I don't think they are traditional nationalists in the old sense. They may be conservative in some ways, but they are not those kinds of politicians at all. They should have an advantage in pushing this issue, a little bit like Nixon goes to China, to use the U.S. context. It is possible for someone at the other end of the political spectrum to do this more easily. But at the moment, I think, and again, the most recent Yomiuri polls, which Bryce cited, underline this again, the Japanese public has very little appetite for pursuing this issue. While a small plurality, 42 to 39%, support constitutional revision, I think fully 74% believe that now is not the time to pursue it. When you ask them why, overwhelmingly, the number one reason they say is because Japan has other issues to deal with, beginning with 311. So, and also I think it would not be a bad idea for the DPJ, given the deep divisions inside that particular party and its evident concern with maintaining unity despite those divisions, to try to pursue an issue which is still potentially highly polarizing and divisive. So I think eventually Japan will overcome its own neurosis, psychosis regarding constitutional reform, just as I, here together with you, am overcoming my own neurosis on the topic. But it'll take a little more time. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Right. My apologies for the technical fireworks in the background during some of that presentation. Our next speaker is Chris Hughes.
So should I stand or is it,
it's up to you.
we should stand? Otherwise I can't even see my side.
Which one's yours? This one here, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Bryce. And and thanks for fixing the technical issues. I have quite a fairly short PowerPoint, but it's really for my own benefit, just to sort of summarise a paper which I submitted to Bryce last week. Bryce asked me to talk really about, whereas Tom was talking more about the kind of the sort of general sort of history of debates about historical constitutional revision, and also some of the obstacles and so on, and some of the politics of it. Bryce asked me to sort of focus on just what are some of the motivations, or at least for some of the key policymakers behind their interest in constitutional revision, and what are some of the plans that they've come up with, and some of the scenarios where, if it actually comes down to it, how constitutional revision might be affected in Japan. So really that's what I'm going to focus on in my talk. Obviously, as you all know, Article 9 establishes really the essential parameters for Japanese security policy. It is, of course, the source of Japan's 1954 interpretation that it has the right of individual self-defense. But likewise, conversely, the interpretation which the Cabinet Legislation Affairs Bureau has held to since then is that Japan does not have the right of collective self-defense. So, of course, this is the key issue for many of those who are thinking about Japanese constitutional revision. And likewise, it's also the source of a number of, even though they're not enshrined in law, nevertheless, it's a source and inspiration for a number of anti-militaristic principles in Japan, which still count very much in terms of encumbering Japanese security policy. So, of course, Article 9 is essential, but at the same time, it's clear that since the 1950s, it's not been an absolute break on Japanese remilitarization, because Japanese policymakers have always had recourse to very ingenious, sort of incredibly genius ability to reinterpret Article 9 to enable the gradual expansion of Japan's own individual national military capabilities and also the scope of Japan's international security cooperation. But having said that, I would say that there are clear motivations, there are clear reasons and rationales within Japan for why constitutional stretching and pushing forward Japan's remilitarization through reinterpretation has reached its limits for key Japanese policymakers. Some of these are ideological, and I think Tom has probably mentioned some of these, and I guess Sabina and Craig may also talk about those. Of course, some of them relate to the fact that many Japanese policymakers, particularly conservative policymakers, are discontented with the post-war settlement, and they see the constitution as something foisted upon Japan by the United States, by an alien force, and which has really, in some ways, subverted Japan's national identity and kept Japan down. And, of course, Japan has to cast that off in order to end the post-war period and to really re-emerge as an independent power. So, of course, ideology is a very, very important driver. But I think what I'm going to concentrate more on today is really just talking about some sort of more pragmatic considerations, everyday considerations that policymakers, many of whom also share ideological motivation, but I think also share very sort of practical, pragmatic motivation of really how to match or to deal, I suppose, with the mismatch between Japan's growing pressures for a broader international security role, both with the United Nations, but also especially within the US-Japan alliance. So this growing role and its mismatch with a sort of declining or diminishing ability to use constant reinterpretation in order to realize that growing role. So there's, in a sense, a sort of divergence between reinterpretation and remilitarization. So for many Japanese policymakers, the logical conclusion is that, therefore, there needs to be revision in order to bring these two together. So that's really what I want to focus on today. I suppose in terms of, again, Tom has covered some of this, but really there have been a number of key moments in the post-Cold War history of Japanese security policy which have obliged Japanese policymakers to push forward Japan's military role, but also have presented difficult questions of how to make that compatible with Article 9. Each time the Japanese policymakers have indeed found a way, but each time their stretching of the constitution has become more and more ingenious, and for some in Japan more and more willful and even dangerous. And here I have a list of the kinds of key moments, but also the kinds of key artifices that the Japanese policymakers have used in order to push forward Japan's military role through reinterpretation. Tom, I think, talked a little bit about the Gulf War, 1990, 1991. Japan was unable to participate in that because of the ban on collective self-defense, and ultimately they did not participate. But then that triggered a debate in Japan about the restrictions of the constitution. And one idea which Ozawa Ichiro came up with at the end of the Gulf War was the idea of collective security. This is not collective self-defense, not individual self-defense, but collective security. Quite an ingenious use of the preamble of the Constitution, of Japan's Constitution, which stresses the idea that Japan should contribute to peace in international society, and link that not with Chapter 7, Article 51, which is the inherent right of collective self-defense, but with Chapter 7, Article 43, link that with the preamble, which stresses much more the responsibility of states to cooperate under the UN aegis in order to provide for international security. So Ozawa came up with this very ingenious idea, which wasn't actually implemented, but this idea of collective security, which, if realized, would have allowed Japan to participate in combat missions with UN approval. In the War on Terror, with the dispatch of the Japan Self-Defense Forces to the Indian Ocean and to Iraq, again, Japanese policymakers found a very difficult choice of how to participate in these operations. Collective self-defense was off the table, partly again because of the resistance to actually exercising this and the ban on that, but also because of the risks, the kind of entrapment risks which Tom talked about, of becoming sucked into open-ended military operations far from home. So that was an anathema to Japanese policymakers. Likewise, individual self-defense would have mandated a combat role for Japan. Japanese policymakers could have argued that Japanese citizens died in the World Trade Center attacks, and therefore Japan could exercise individual self-defense. But again, that would have mandated a very open-ended combat role. So instead, Japanese policymakers, without actually saying it, but nevertheless they managed to do it, they kind of stumbled upon some kind of variety of Ozawa's collective security idea. And Koizumi, when he dispatched the JSDF overseas, he talked nothing about Article 9. He completely bypassed that and talked about the preamble as a legitimization for Japan's participation in non-combat logistical and reconstruction missions. So again, this kind of stretching of the Constitution, finding an ingenious way forward, but bypassing Article 9, the real issue. Likewise, regional contingencies, amazing contortionism from Japanese policymakers in the passage of the 1999 regional contingency legislation. Japan wanted to be able to refuel US ships during contingencies in East Asia, but nevertheless had to find a way to make this possible so that this wouldn't become joined with the use of force, which was banned under the Constitution. And it came up with some sort of amazing, bureaucrats came up with incredible justifications talking about how you could demarcate non-combat and combat zones within the East Asia region in something like a Korean Peninsula contingency, and the JSDF could be just outside those zones and they could refuel US ships. Again, you know, when it came to actual military interoperability, many policymakers thought this was a nonsense. But nevertheless, in order to actually pass the legislation and make these kinds of operations possible, Japan came up with these very ingenious devices. And then I think one of the biggest drivers which is exercising the minds of Japanese policymakers is what to do about ballistic missile defense. Japan's joining with the United States. I mean, of course, Japanese policymakers argue that ballistic missile defense serves purely for Japan's own individual self-defense. It's not integrated with the US system. But, of course, it presents all kinds of interesting challenges. What happens if a missile passes over Japanese territory or is headed towards US territory? The United States would have an expectation that Japan's self-defense forces, because of its possession of ballistic missile defense capability, should actually intercept that missile. What happens if Japan sort of idly sits by and does nothing? Japanese policymakers, again, incredibly ingenious. They would argue, well, actually our system can't do this anyway, so they would kind of use this argument against the United States. Or even the most extraordinary justification I heard was that, well, we can shoot down missiles if they're headed for US territory, and we can do this under the right of individual collective self-defense, because there's always a possibility that some of the debris or the sort of second stage of this missile might drop on Japan, and that would damage Japan, so therefore we have to shoot it down. So again, it's sort of very ingenious ways round the central problem of trying to avoid exercising the right of collective self-defense. And again, this came up with the anti-piracy missions that the Japan self-defense forces embarked on from 2009 onwards. How to protect friendly shipping. Would this transgress over the right of collective self-defense? And again, Japanese policymakers came up with rather ingenious justifications, arguing that the Japan self-defense forces wasn't really using force in a military sense, it was using a police action sense, so therefore it was okay. And also, if it was protecting ships near to Japan's self-defense forces ships, well, those ships could be attacked as well. So therefore, the self-defense forces could act against the pirates because the Japan self-defense forces might be threatened. So again, blurring the lines between individual and collective self-defense. But of course, all of these very ingenious artifices have their problems, have their drawbacks, and don't really, I think in the eyes of many Japanese policymakers, don't really offer a sustainable way forward to deal with fundamental security problems that face Japan long term, and they really inhibit long-term security planning. Collective security, the kind of the Ozawa type concept, is fine, but really if you're going to go that route, that means you put the Japan self-defense forces really at the disposal of the United Nations. You always have to continually link everything to UN resolutions. And there's always a risk that what you're doing is actually, in some ways, incapacitating Japan's ability to act because it becomes linked to the activities of the UN. And, of course, distances the Japan self-defense forces from the United States, potentially, if the US wants to act outside UN remits. And, of course, the prime interest of the Japan self-defense forces policymakers is to strengthen the alliance rather than to, in some way, divorce Japan from the alliance. Likewise, some kind of combination of collective security, or these very clever uses of individual self-defense and blurring the lines with collective self-defense is fine. It worked in Iraq. It worked in the Indian Ocean. But really, in some ways, it makes a nonsense of genuine military or alliance interoperability with the United States, because the Japan Self-Defense Forces are hemmed in with so many restrictions, to the point that Japan Self-Defense Forces is protected by the troops of other nations, as in Iraq, that it really, it actually encumbers alliance cooperation. Very good for hedging, if that's what you want to do, as Tom talked about. But if you really want to sort of move forward alliance cooperation, clearly it's very, very difficult. And of course, all of these measures are very politically and legislatively costly. It takes a tremendous amount of time for the Japanese government to pass these measures through the national diet, always enacting single, time-bound, separate laws, which, again, excellent for hedging, but used up tremendous amounts of political energy for Japanese policymakers. So I think many Japanese policymakers would argue, those who are obviously extremely interested in defence issues and want to push forward the alliance, and also want to avoid a sort of continual stretching of the constitution, and want to make sure that Japan has a much sort of neater set and clearer set of parameters, both to, if you like, expand cooperation with the United States, but also to limit cooperation with the United States. So, really, constitutional reinterpretation is reaching its limits for many policymakers. I won't talk too much about this. I think Tom talked about this to some extent, but certainly in recent years there have been a number of moves towards reinterpretation. 2005, we had both the House of Councillors and House of Representatives produce reports, some divergence between them, but some commonalities, agreeing that Japan really should recognise that it does have, and it should be written into the Constitution, a right of individual self-defence, a recognition that the self-defence forces, despite the fact they've been around for more than 50 years, actually do exist. They really do. Japan really does have a military. And also that Japan should have some international cooperation responsibilities. Japan's military and security responsibilities are not simply for the defence of its own territory. And again, this is a kind of new commonality. 2005, we had the LDP produced its own draft revised constitution. 2004-2005, what was then the main opposition party, the DPJ, produced its own, not draft constitution, but some proposals to think about constitutional revision. Of course, the DPJ is yet to actually produce a final draft of how it might like to see a revised constitution, which again goes back to many of the splits within the DPJ that Tom described. 2006, Prime Minister Abe managed to push through the referendum legislation in order to actually make that stage of constitutional revision possible. If you get the two-thirds majority in both houses, then it would go to a national referendum. So for the first time, Japanese policymakers actually put in place that legislation to make that possible. 2007, 2008, we had very interesting, I think probably Craig may talk about this some more, but we had the very interesting Yanai report, which was instituted by Prime Minister Abe. And what he was trying to do is, of course, he was pushing forward on sort of more formal, he wanted more formal constitutional revision with the national referendum legislation and so on. But also what he was trying to do, I think, was trying to prepare the ground and set a number of precedents which could be used in the future in order to trigger and push forward, if not de facto, then if not de jure, then de facto reinterpretation. So a very interesting report talked about how Japan should exercise collective self-defense in BMD and protection of US vessels, which were operating close by to JSDF vessels, and also how Japan could expand, not through collective self-defense, but through just certain kinds of reinterpretations and existing laws, a greater role in UNPKO and supporting UNPKO operations, even including the use of force in those operations. 2009, the moratorium ended on actually putting forward specific proposals in the Diet for constitutional revision, and the LDP, out of power by this time, was free to really push ahead on this issue, and since then it's had its own headquarters on constitutional revision. And then in 2011, as Bryce talked about, the DPJ finally began to get round to thinking more seriously about constitutional revision. So what kinds of plans might we actually see? I mean, how might Japanese policymakers actually affect constitutional revision? What are the plans on the table? Well, the last plans by the LDP in 2005, and we'll have to see what their new headquarters comes up with. But, of course, the LDP is arguing very much for straight revision, kaiken. And the key points are, again, the self-defense forces are recognized as a military. It's very key that they're written into the Constitution. Various kinds of names for what this military is going to be called. But the idea is it's a jie-gun. So for the first time, it's not just a force, it's actually a military is written into these into the proposals. Likewise, Japan, under the LDP proposals, has very clear international security responsibilities as well. That has to be written into the Constitution. And then what the LDP was proposing was to provide, alongside constitutional revision, would be a fundamental national security law. And this would be the kind of law where the LDP could load the really controversial things into. And, of course, it's much easier to pass because you only need a simple majority in the Diet rather than the 2/3. So you can load all the controversial, difficult issues into this, including collective self-defense. So this would have been the vehicle to push forward collective self-defense. And the LDP could argue, well, it's in the Constitution, right? It's in the preamble, it's in Article 9, we have a military, right? Not just a self-defense force, but a military. It has international security responsibilities. Naturally, we should exercise the right of collective self-defense. And that would have been through the fundamental national security law. The DPJ plans, again, we have to actually see what the DPJ will come up with, but the DPJ talks more about Zolken, this idea of augmenting the Constitution. The idea is that they argue the Constitution has been hollowed out by the LDP, by constant reinterpretation, and so what we need to do now is to kind of catch up with the realities on the ground by augmenting the Constitution in order to take account of those. Lots of similarities with the LDP plan. Again, the JSDF is recognised, exists. International security responsibilities are recognised, but more emphasis on the idea that those responsibilities should be with the UN rather than as the LDP's more open-ended, simple international security responsibilities, which, of course, would indicate cooperation with the United States. And likewise, a fundamental national security law to go with this in order to deal with the sort of trickier issues. Just to sort of wrap up then, so what are the actual scenarios for revision? How might revision come about? I think there are kind of three ways Japanese policymakers might go about marrying up these proposals with actual moves to revise the Constitution. And they would have different implications for Japan's security. The first one would be a kind of LDP-type full revision. Of course, the LDP has to get back into power to do this, or the DPJ has to somehow buy into the idea that full revision, major radical revision is what is necessary. But this would be, revision of Article 9, fundamental national security law, and this would really, in a sense, could potentially breach every taboo on Japan's exercise of military power, allowing Japan to participate in the full range of UN operations, including use of force, in US alliance operations, US-led coalition missions. Although I think, again, the LDP would still try to hedge somewhat by using the fundamental national security law to build in some restrictions to these operations, clearer restrictions, so Japan couldn't be pulled around by the United States into more open-ended missions and probably focus more on East Asian missions. Second scenario might be some kind of compromise between the LDP and the DPJ, because surely they're going to have to work together if they want a 2/3 majority in the Diet. And I think this may just be simple recognition of de facto realities. SDF exists, international security responsibilities, and so on. But again, this would somewhat erode the taboos on Japan's exercise of military power, probably more ability to participate in a wider range of UN PKO-type operations. But again, I think a lot of the trickier things would have to be once again left to reinterpretation. And then, of course, the final scenario is gridlock, really. I think this is a possible scenario. In fact, nothing happens. Everything gets put in the too difficult box. And Japan is left, again, limited participation in UN PKO, and we have to revert to these rather uncomfortable, increasingly difficult but nevertheless still possible creative reinterpretations. Okay, final word. My own view is that I think I've possibly the opposite to Tom. I mean, I think in 2005, 2006, I was quite convinced that Japan would move towards revision. I've become less and less convinced, actually, and more aware of the obstacles, I think. I won't go into them, but I think there's a number of obstacles. Obviously, the DPJ, Tom talked about this, deep internal divisions on revision. Clearly, the DPJ has other problems to deal with right now than actually sort of burning up energy on constitutional revision. I wonder how far the DPJ and LDP really can cooperate, because they're very adversarial. I mean, they talk about grand coalition, but it's a very adversarial type of relationship at the moment. Is the Japanese public really interested? I think Tom has the polling information on that. And I think really ultimately the only way that revision may be moved on is through some kind of external shock. And again, I think Tom alluded to this. And again, it may take the North Koreans to spook Japanese policymakers, and in order to actually give them the jolt to move forward on constitutional revision. So I do actually see, short of some kind of major crisis in Japanese security policy, I think reinterpretation and stretching may be the way forward. Although, again, as I say, Japanese policymakers will realise the difficulties of this and just how incompatible much of this stretching of the constitution really is with their ambitions for how they want to move on Japan's security policy. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Okay, our next speaker is Craig Martin.
Thank you, and I'd like to just begin by as well thanking Bryce for the invitation. It's great to be here. Although I should just correct one thing that he said in the interest of not being accused of misrepresenting my CV or having Handai after me. My PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania,
Sorry,
not
it is
from
too.
Osaka.
Your MA is from
You
Handai,
just see
though,
letters
right?
coming from Osaka University.
Gosh.
So my work is, to the extent that it's on Japan, has really been on the extent to which Article 9 represents an example of an incorporation of international law principles into a constitution in a way that has successfully constrained a national government's use of force. So I come at this sort of from that perspective, and I'm going to sort of be the lawyer in the room, so to speak. So I'm going to try to both be brief and to keep it sort of high level at this point, and we can drill down into the details if people have questions in the question period, because I'm sympathetic with Tom's aversion for legalistic analysis. So, but I do think that it's important at the outset just to get or establish sort of a baseline as to what Article 9 really means, and so that we're all clear as to what we're talking about. So I think most people are probably familiar with the story. It's a fantastic story of constitutional creation, the 24 Americans drafting the Constitution in the dead of night. But Article 9 in particular was a fascinating provision, which is a creation both taken from international law. One aspect of it is made out of whole cloth, and then a third element is taken from one legal regime and inserted for purposes of creating a check in a different legal regime. So this is the MacArthur memo. We can come back to it if people are interested. This is the actual language of MacArthur's memo, which was practically written on the back of a napkin and given to General Whitney as the basis for Article 9 in the Constitution. It's only really important for the purposes, if we're interested, as Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas would be, in the original intent of the drafters. You might want to go back and look at that. These are just some slides of the sort of translation process. But Article 9, as it stands today, is as is on this slide. And it's important to recognize that it has really three separate elements, right, that are found in the two different paragraphs. So the first is the renunciation of war and the threat or use of force. And this is language that's taken from the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 and Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, and is clearly an incorporation of international law principles into the Constitution for the purpose of constraining the nation's use of force in a jus ad bellum sense. Jus ad bellum, it's the last Latin I'll use, I promise, is the legal regime in international law that governs recourse to war or the use of force. And so here is an example of a government or a state incorporating an international law principle governing the use of force into the Constitution as a mechanism for constraining the use of force. The second element is the denial or the prohibition on the maintenance of armed forces. And in my view, this in many ways has been far more controversial as an element of Article 9, and yet this has no precedent anywhere. I mean, MacArthur basically just made this up on the fly and clearly had the intent of simply disarming Japan and keeping Japan in a disarmed state, although MacArthur would later deny that that was his purpose. I mean, that was essentially revisionist history in the midst of a Cold War, but that clearly seems to have been his intent at the time. There's really no precedent. The only other country that has anything like it is Costa Rica today. The third element is even more interesting, and this is the denial of the rights of belligerency. The denial of the rights of belligerency is a concept taken from the international law regime called jus in bello, or international humanitarian law, which governs the conduct of armed forces within armed conflict. And this is clear from MacArthur's memo if we were to go back. And there are two different competing theories in Japanese scholarship as to what this element of Article 9 means. It's an element of Article 9 that's usually ignored, but I'll come back to it in the Yanai report context. One theory, in my view, is clearly wrong and just misapprehends the nature of the international law principles. But what is fascinating is that there's this attempt to use a jus in bello principle embedded in a constitution to actually have the effect of checking the state's ability to use force. So it's for a jus ad bellum purpose. Right? It has absolutely no ability to operate at the international law level. What it really means in basic terms is that the Japanese military, if they were to be engaged in armed conflict, would not enjoy the rights of belligerency that all other armed forces enjoy. That is, they could be prosecuted for murder under Japanese law. They could be sued for wrongful death for the killing of an Iraqi in Iraq. The obvious response to that of any other combatant would be, I'm a combatant in an armed conflict. I'm immune under the laws of armed conflict. But as a result of this element of Article 9, a Japanese court could well say, well, there's a denial of rights of belligerency. You do not have that immunity. And we can talk in the discussion period if people are interested. The Cabinet Legislation Bureau clearly understands this, and the Iraq Special Measures Law and the Anti-Terrorism Special Measures Law had provisions within them that tracked the criminal law defenses for the use of force, so that the Jiitai, when they were in Iraq, could use no more force than would be permissible under Japan's criminal law. In other words, to defend them from the possibility of lawsuits under Japanese law if they exceeded that. So those are the three elements, and if in my submission, under a normal constitutional law and international law analysis, the only real interpretation of Article 9 would be that there's no permissible use of force at all, even in individual self-defense. The language says that, as you see here, that it renounces war and the threat or use of force as a sovereign right of a nation. The only sovereign right of any nation under the UN system is individual or collective self-defense or collective security operations as authorized by the UN Security Council. So that is precisely what Japan is renouncing. But that, of course, is not the established interpretation of Article 9, and that's really what we need to look at. Right? So the established interpretation of Article 9 has been alluded to by Tom and Chris, first by the Cabinet Legislation Bureau in 1954 and confirmed again in 57 and 60 and 74, is that because of something called the Ashida Amendment, which we can talk about in the question period if people have an interest in it, Article 9 can be interpreted to mean that Japan has an individual right of self-defense, that the prohibition is only on uses of force that go beyond individual self-defense, and because of the first clause of paragraph 2, that the prohibition on the maintenance of armed forces is only really a prohibition on armed forces that exceed the minimum necessary for individual self-defense. And so that has been the established interpretation since 1954 with the conversion of the NPR into the Jietai. And as Tom alluded to, Yoshida Shigeru deliciously used this as a shield against pressure from the United States. And there's a great quote where he is talking to his then aide, Miyazawa, who would go on to be prime minister, saying it's really rather zurui or devious for us to use it this way, but, why would we want to revise Article 9 when we can use it to prevent involvement in the Cold War? So the question then is, in my view, whether Article 9 has actually operated effectively to do anything. As Chris has alluded to, there's been sort of shifts in policy constrained by Article 9, but nonetheless have, through ingenious mechanisms, attempted to get out from under the constraints of Article 9. And in my research, I've tried to make the argument that, in fact, Article 9 has, and by Article 9 here, I'm really referring to Article 9, Paragraph 1, which I think is by far the more important of the clauses in Article 9. This is the renunciation of war and the use of force. This is a true incorporation of an international law principle. Article 9, Paragraph 1 has actually effectively constrained Japanese policy in very important ways. And this was seen most strikingly during the Gulf War, when the United States was bringing extraordinary pressure upon Japan to put boots on the ground in Kuwait. And there was a truly felt need within Japan to comply for the sake of the alliance. There was a sense of pending crisis in foreign relations, and the Kaifu cabinet wanted desperately to comply. Ozawa Ichiro stormed into the Prime Minister's office and demanded that they put boots on the ground, and the director of the Cabinet Legislation Bureau said, you can't do it. Article 9, we can't engage in collective self-defense. And so in my view, that is an example of Article 9 operating as a true pre-commitment device. We think of constitutions as being pre-commitment devices in the sense that when they're drafted, when they're created, the drafters put in place mechanisms to constrain future governments in times of crisis, in times of passion, in the way that the metaphor that's often used, Ulysses was bound to the mast so that he could nonetheless listen to the siren song and not lose his head and jump overboard. Well, here in the Gulf War was Ulysses bound to the mast and unable to use force in a way that there was a real felt need they had to do. Having said that, there have been, as Chris has stated, there have been efforts since then to try desperately to get out from under some of these constraints. And there's no question that Article 9, Paragraph 2 has been ignored in large measure. I mean, this is where you get into all these surreal discussions that I think drive Tom crazy about, what is defensive military versus offensive military, and is a nuclear weapon really offensive or defensive, and how do you parse that, and does the Jietai really constitute a military? I've had generals from the Jietai tell me, well, I'm not in the military. I'm former military myself, and I sort of raised my eyebrows, and he says, well, you and I know I'm in the military, but if I said I was in the military, it would be on the front page of the Asahi Shimbun tomorrow, so I'm not really in the military. And so you have these surreal conversations, but that's really about Article 9, Paragraph 2, and which brings you to the question of amendment. In my view, for reasons that are very different from the arguments that have been made by both Tom and Chris, I think that amendment is actually called for. And mine is not really sort of the analysis of whether it will happen, but more a question of whether it should happen. And I make the normative argument that it should from a legal perspective, in the sense that I think, in particular, Article 9, Paragraph 2, and the existence of the GIETAI, with the fifth largest military budget in the world, an increasingly sophisticated Navy, and ability to project power, which Chris writes about all the time and knows much more than I, it's laughable to suggest that the GIETAI is not a military, or that it's even really a strictly defensive force. And so when you have this increasing gap between the reality and the constitutional provision, it erodes and undermines the normative power of the Constitution. And so I think that there are arguments to be made from the left for amendment of Article 9. And in my view, the mistake that's being made by the left, and I don't mean just the Shakai or the old Shakaito or the political left, but even amongst scholars and those who are strong believers in the integrity of Article 9 and the pacifist principles that form the third pillar of the Japanese Constitution, there is this sense of denial. There's this sense that if you touch Article 9, sort of as Tom sort of brilliantly put it, that the whole thing's going to wither on the vine. It's, the flower is going to die. And so there's a sort of head in the sand, don't touch it. If we touch it, we run the risk of losing the whole kit and caboodle. It's a slippery slope. And as a result, they are not developing any plausible or persuasive alternative to the proposals that are being advanced by the Jiminto or the Minjuto. And as I'll come to, I think there are aspects of the proposals of, in particular, the LDP, because the LDP is the only party that's actually put out language, that are deeply concerning and ought to be deeply concerning to people who care both about the Constitution and about the spirit underlying Article 9, and I'll come to those. And so I think it's a profound political and legal mistake on the part of the left to be simply in this position of denial, that if you care about the spirit of Article 9 and the spirit with which Article 9 was embraced by the Japanese people after it was ratified, they ought to be thinking about how it could and should be amended. And I would suggest that to take from the GIETAI or the Jiminto's proposal, Jiminto is basically, as Chris pointed out, first of all, suggests that Article 9, Paragraph 2 just be deleted. So you just get rid of the whole prohibition on the maintenance of armed forces and denial of rights of belligerency. And I think actually that makes sense. I mean, as Chris has said, the GIETAI exists, and we ought to just recognize that it exists. But I think that in its place, that there ought to be both a recognition of a GIETAI. There should be provisions that establish civilian control, because when Article 9 was drafted, since there was an assumption that there would be no military, there are no provisions in the Japanese Constitution regarding civilian control. I think that there should be provisions regarding legislative approval of deployments of the military and legislative approval by two-thirds majority of any use of force. Now, this will no doubt drive Tom crazy. He was talking about how costly, or was it, I can't remember, it might have been Chris was talking about how costly it is to get the approval of the Diet for each and every deployment. And I would argue that that's precisely the point. Right? And we're having this debate in the United States as well. As people will recall, not very long ago, there was a considerable kerfuffle because President Obama refused to go to Congress to get approval for military operations in Libya, in apparent contravention of the War Powers provision of the Constitution and certainly the War Powers Act. Right? And those kinds of constitutional provisions requiring legislative approval are important for the very reason that it costs political capital to mobilize the sufficient political will to use force. Right? And that is precisely the spirit that animates and was at the heart of Article 9 at the outset. So I would argue that Article 9, Paragraph 2 be replaced with something that requires precisely that kind of legislative approval rather than gut it. And I think Article 9, Paragraph 1 should be amended to conform more clearly with international law. Right now, it's quite obvious. Article 9, Paragraph 1 goes much further. It denies Japan rights that it has under international law, as Tom at the very outset said, that it finds it confusing that Japan should have this right, but it should be illegal to exercise it. As a matter of law, that actually makes absolute sense, that you can waive a right and that you can place constraints in Ulysses-type terms on a government to prevent it from exercising a right that it might have under international law. But I think it should be clarified. And it should be clarified that Japan has the right to use force as a matter of individual self-defense. And then there needs to be a debate as to whether Japan is going to be permitted to engage in collective self-defense, or whether it is only going to be allowed to engage in collective security operations as authorized by the UN Security Council. And this is Ozawa's argument, and he reaches back to the preamble to justify this, as Chris has alluded to. But it's important to understand the difference as a matter of international law. Collective security operations as authorized by the Security Council would mean, as Chris says, that Japan would only be entitled to use force of any kind in the event that there was authorization from the UN Security Council. Collective self-defense just means that Japan could, sort of ride shotgun with the United States in the next adventure that was under the banner of self-defense. Whether it would be Iraq, as in Iraq, which was labeled as self-defense, Japan would be there if it was collective self-defense. There's no requirement for UN security authorization. So I'm running short on time, so let me just fast forward very quickly to the Yanai report, and I'm happy to talk about this in the question period more. From a legal perspective, the idea of having an expert panel come up with a revision of the interpretation, and I want to repeat that. The idea that Abe put to this committee was the revision of the interpretation of the Constitution. And in legal terms, that is absurd, right? And it is illegitimate. For one, the panel is extra-constitutional. It has no constitutional authority whatsoever to be interpreting the Constitution. But moreover, the idea that you could revise the interpretation as opposed to revise the Constitution is ridiculous. There is an amendment provision within the Constitution for a reason, in the same sense that I talked about constitutions being pre-commitment devices. Drafters put in amendment procedures that may be more or less difficult for the very purpose of making it difficult to change the provisions of the Constitution. You cannot make an end run around those amendment procedures by revising an interpretation when it becomes inconvenient to you. And so, in my submission, the idea of the Yanai Commission was illegitimate to begin with. And as Chris points out, the problem with it is that it stood every prospect of being successful. Right? Abe could, or now Minshuto could, hold up the expert panel's reinterpretation and say, well, here it is. It's an authoritative interpretation of the Constitution that now allows us to do collective self-defense. And because, and I haven't talked about this, but the Supreme Court has, since 1960, essentially abdicated its responsibility and its obligations and duties under the Constitution to interpret Article 9. There's every reason to believe that it would just lie down in the face of a reinterpretation by an expert panel. And so I think that the idea of allowing an expert panel to reinterpret the Constitution should be cause of a great deal of concern. In the course of answers to questions, I can talk about why I think the substance of the Yanai report's reinterpretation is deeply flawed on all kinds of levels. It was a result-oriented analysis from the get-go, saying, the strategic situation has changed, therefore the meaning of Article 9 has changed, would be a way to sum up the analysis of the Yanai committee report. So I will leave it there, but I look forward to sort of fleshing out some of the bones during questions. Thank you.
Great. Our next speaker is Sabina Frühstück. Okay.
Good afternoon. As Bryce already mentioned, I wrote a book from a very ethnographic and historical perspective on the Japanese self-defense forces because it interested me how service members deal with all those complications that our panelists here have addressed. I appreciate very much that Bryce had the imagination and the courage and the creativity to include me in this panel, to take a similar approach as I did in my book, namely focus on some of the core components of the constitutional debate, but instead of talking about the ideological posturing of politicians such as Mayhara, I want to describe how some of the participants in the debate deal with realities on the ground. And of course, there's a wide range of constituencies and groups of people one might look at. I choose three here. One is the Japanese population at large, and I'll keep this short because several of my previous speakers here have already addressed opinion polls. Service members of the self-defense forces, what do those people who are actually supposed to then go to Iraq and to Honduras and to Cambodia and to who knows where else, what do they think about their position? And the United States forces in Japan. First, the public. Anybody debating the Constitution needs to keep in mind that it was not only written by the United States, but that recent debates about changing Article 9 have also been driven primarily by American, not Japanese, security concerns. Let's not lose sight of the fact that large parts of the Japanese population hold dear the following opinions, and I intentionally do not speak of majorities here, but large portions of the population. Article 9 remains useful in preserving Japan's peace and prosperity. The Constitution should not be modified. The Constitution should only be modified to reflect the current uses of the self-defense forces. The self-defense forces should not be turned into a conventional / normal military, and we can talk about what that is supposed to mean. The Constitution should be revised to legitimize the engagement in collective self-defense, and the Constitution denies the right of collective self-defense, and this should remain so. Just a few of these opinions, but I think it's important to point them out here because since I last checked what democracy means, it meant to exercise the will of the people. Opinion polls of the last 30 years indicate, and I'm one of these hopefully very few people who have spent a lot of time looking through opinion polls and every single question and how these changed. Opinion polls of the last 30 years indicate that a majority of Japanese people view the self-defense forces positively with regards to its work in disaster relief missions and peacekeeping missions that are designed to provide non-combative support. In short, missions other than war. This is an important point to make, particularly as one of the most pronounced public concerns with regards to a possible amendment of the Constitution is the fear that Japan might then be dragged into an American war. And that's a very real, very clear concern that emerges from whatever kind of opinion poll on Article 9 or the self-defense forces or the U.S.-Japan alliance you look at. These public fears are not unfounded, and I move now to the self-defense forces. According to most pundits, the recent deployment of Japan's self-defense forces to Iraq constituted a deployment to a war zone. Eager to please the U.S. administration at the time, but facing a Japanese citizenry whose majority was against such a deployment, then Prime Minister Koizumi felt prompted to publicly promise that no Japanese soldier would kill or die. The mission would be in line with previous peacekeeping missions and thus exclude combat and armed defense as engagement options. And I'm sure that my co-panelists here and some of you might have followed the news about this deployment nervously because that became, at least within the Japanese public discourse, the core point. Is somebody going to kill somebody there? Is somebody going to get killed in some kind of combative situation? And that did not happen. However, in my conversations with Japanese service members over the last 15 years or so, the restriction on service members' use of weapons on some international deployments constitutes one of the core issues of contention. Returning from a peacekeeping mission One Army officer remembers that he was frightened when off duty and unarmed. He told me, quote, "I was very self-conscious every single minute, knowing that I had no appropriate weapon on me to defend myself if anything happened. I also felt ridiculed and pitied by men of other units of the UN forces who shook their head over us Japanese because they thought that we did things rather strangely." End of quote. The Self-Defense Forces' precarious position in light of the Constitution and service members' ambivalence towards the missions they participate in translates in distinctive public relations efforts. The Self-Defense Forces, and I have to keep this brief for our purposes here, public relations apparatus projects a series of civilianizing, familiarizing, trivializing, and spectacularizing messages about the military's capabilities, roles, and character. Some of these messages are mutually reinforcing, whereas others are ambiguous and contradictory. No matter how different, contradictory, and unrealistic these images might be, the core message is designed to make the self-defense forces appear useful and necessary. These images deliberately appeal to recruitable youth, worried parents, and complacent and even hostile citizens. For instance, the role of violence in the self-defense force is deeply problematic. Some observers assume that the training for and prospect of combat is what really holds the military together. Yet, during the deployment to Iraq, the closest Japanese soldiers ever come to war, recruitment rates have decreased, the number of suicides have soared, and returnees from Iraq have expressed primarily relief that everybody survived the mission unharmed. The public relations efforts by the self-defense forces does not cover up some hidden real character of the military that is assumed to be its potential for violence. Rather, at a time of an ever-shrinking population of potential male recruits, and in light of the recent enormity of Japan's domestic disaster, it has become increasingly difficult for public relations to maintain the notion that combat is the core role of the military. How would one summon a nation's troops under the dictum of national defense against natural disasters? In light of these various functions that the self-defense forces perform, it appears that they symbolically arm and disarm themselves for public consumption in order to convince the fearful that they are protected and the peaceful that they need not feel threatened. Enter the Japan-US Security Alliance and the United States Forces Japan, who have struggled to overcome what they perceive to be a largely unsympathetic or even hostile Japanese population. At the occasion of the recent 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the United States and Japan that was signed in Washington here on January 19, 1960, the Public Relations Office of USFJ released the first of 4 volumes of a manga, Watashitachi no Dome, Eizokuteki Partnership, Our Alliance, A Lasting Partnership. Despite its express purpose to burnish the reputation of USFJ and appease critics of the alliance, the launch of this entirely new public relations effort was unfortunately timed. Delayed by several months, it was released 2 days prior to the 65th anniversary of the dropping of Little Boy on August 6, 1945. It also came shortly after the failure to create a new base to replace Futenma Marine Corps Air Station. In this politically and militarily charged environment, explained the director of the Public Relations Office, every element in the manga suddenly meant something. While the anniversary might have been an opportunity for a critical reflection on the history of the alliance and its relevance to the current moment, this was not desired by the PR office. Rather, the manga playfully describes a carefree US-Japan alliance and confirms the role that USFJ have played in this relationship. 2 characters dominate the narrative. One is Miss Alliance, an ordinary-looking Japanese girl with long dark hair and glasses who impersonates Japan. The other is Mr. USA, a boy visiting from and embodying the United States who wears shorts and a bunny hoodie. The 2 figures contemplate the role of USFJ and the usefulness of the US-Japan alliance. I won't go into the aesthetics of the manga or even the details of the narrative, but let me quickly describe some of the key moments. And I deeply regret now that I didn't bring the images I have to go with this, but I thought this center is a no-nonsense place, and as I thought I should not do that. Mr. USA roams Miss Alliance's house with a rolled-up newspaper while Miss Alliance eats a cookie and watches television. Mr. USA finds a cockroach in the kitchen and kills it. Miss Alliance inquires why Mr. USA has come to protect her home. He announces that they share an alliance and thus are important friends. Despite the children's conversation about the 50-year relationship, the narrative is deliberately ahistorical. There's no narrative about the actual historical impact of the treaty. Too hot to handle are the stories about Japan being used as a launching pad for American troops during various American wars, from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, or the stories of the political, economic, and environmental burden military bases pose, particularly in Okinawa. As Miss Alliance contemplates the notion of a country's right to self-defense, Mr. USA asks her to join him in the extermination of cockroaches. She prefers to leave that to him while she continues to eat breakfast and meditate on the right of self-defense. Another conversation in the manga emphasizes that the two children, and by extension the two countries, share a number of values. Nothing even hints at the possibilities of why Miss Alliance actually needs to be convinced of the similarities about which Mr. USA is so adamant. His instruction is successful because it has to overcome only her ignorance, naivete, and doubt, not a difference in her perspective, an awareness of the inequality of the relationship, concerns about the legality of the current alliance, or Japan's sovereignty as a nation-state. Military public relations efforts around the world promote an impressive variety of images of themselves. These include selective, cleansed, and aestheticized images of what the military claims they do. Accordingly, such images typically center on the military capacity to project power and use sophisticated technology, for instance, while carefully suppressing its capacity to kill large numbers of people and cause enormous destruction and environmental disasters. Other images underscore what the military promises to provide its members. These images focus on a portrayal of the military as a platform to mature as an adult, show courage, and or sacrifice oneself for a national objective. Alternatively, military organizations present themselves as a valuable, or at least a predictable, career path. Military establishments the world over perceive such public relations activities as increasingly necessary in order to identify and attract new recruits. At the same time, public interest in and the willingness to go to war has decreased in many Western democratic societies, and I think living in the United States somewhat makes one somewhat blind for that development in other places. On this front, Japan is an obvious case in point. The public relations officers of both the Self-Defense Forces and the United States Forces Japan agree that Japan is a particularly difficult place to successfully engage in such efforts. The environment is challenging, says a PR office representative, I quote. Japan has lived in a peaceful environment for so long that they don't see the need for a standing military and thus don't understand the role of the U.S. military in the country. In that sense, the situation of the U.S. military is similar to their own self-defense forces, but on top of it, we are foreigners, end of quote. The PR office measures the success of its public relations efforts by comparing the number of hits on the USFJ homepage. Before the manga was posted, the PR office got about 900 hits per day. Since the manga has become available, it gets about 100,000. The increase of the hit rate at the USFJ website does not, of course, answer two questions, such as who is reading the manga and how sophisticated the reading might be. Nichanaru, which with 10 million users is one of the world's largest internet fora, provides some hints. One poster writing in Japanese asks whether the cockroaches in Miss Alliance's Japan's kitchen are Korean or Chinese. Another calls it propaganda, and yet another expresses his discomfort at the claim that Japanese and Americans are similar. Posters writing in English are less polite, calling the manga Aryan propaganda shit, and worse, or suggesting that, quote, the boy lifts off the girl and in return only squishes a cockroach? Yeah, that about sums up America's contributions to the world, stealing the best of our crap and attacking less powerful nations. End of quote. While the hostile tone is typical for Nichanuru discussions, which are anonymous, they invite doubts about whether the manga actually achieves its twin objectives, to create a more sympathetic attitude towards U.S. forces in Japan and to solidify the alliance as the best solution to potential security issues in Japan and East Asia. Beyond the question of the success of the manga within the parameters of the Public Relations Office, the choice of two children as representatives of two of the most powerful nation-states in the world further infantilizes these nations and their capabilities while also underestimating the experience and intelligence of their populace. In terms of addressing the tensions between the two militaries and the Japan that is divided concerning the continued presence of the U.S. military in the country, the 50th anniversary commemorations of the U.S.-Japanese alliance was a lost opportunity and as such in line with the political developments that the Japanese government so vehemently refuses to directly address. Let me conclude. I've been asked to share my thoughts on the impact of the debate on Article 9 of the Constitution. As we have seen, there are a variety of answers, depending on who one asks. The Japanese population is far from being convinced that removing Article 9 is desirable, and only a weak majority of the population is in favor of revising Article 9 to legitimize the kinds of missions the self-defense forces has become engaged in over the past 20 years. While there is limited data about attitudes of service members of the self-defense forces, it becomes clear from my interviews and conversations with service members that opinions vary greatly. These range from those who believe, and I emphasize this here because I went into these conversations assuming that, of course, members of the military would want Article 9 to be removed or revised in one way or another. In fact, however, these range from those who believe that the status quo should remain in place to others who would prefer Article 9 be modified to reflect their existence and current engagements as fully legitimate armed forces. In the end, what remains clear and unambiguous is the discomfort of U.S. forces Japan and, by extension, the U.S. administration with the Japanese Constitution. While the administration of this country continues to plan for worst-case military scenarios, Japanese media announced this week that the self-defense forces units ended most of the 8 missions they had undertaken in northeastern Japan following the March 11th earthquake and tsunami. The SDF had deployed as many as 107,000 personnel, that's more than half of their active personnel, to 7 disaster-hit prefectures, including Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima. They have been engaged in search and rescue operations and have helped prepare meals for survivors at evacuation centers. The self-defense forces have also been instrumental in attempts to cool the crippled reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant by spraying water from the air and ground. In light of this largest mission to date of the self-defense forces and the increase of such disasters in Japan and elsewhere, or the likely increase, I should say, I wonder whether we are even asking the right question. With respect to peace and security in Japan and around the world, is it really in the Japanese population's best interest to focus on Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution? And I believe Tom has suggested that according to recent polls, the answer is no. Shouldn't Maehara and associates instead be rethinking the narrow confines and almost exclusively military terms of Japan's security and begin facing the very real threats that nature has in store for Japan and the world? Chris talked about the necessity of an external shock to bring the conversation forward, as I think he put it. If that wasn't an internal shock, then I don't know what would be. Thank you.
Okay, it's time for Q&A. If the standard rules apply, if you'll please raise your hand. We have people with microphones coming around. And if you could identify yourself, of course, by your name, but also by any institutional affiliation that you might have.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired U.S. government, now private consultant. I have a question about the current DPJ government and the degree of attention or lack of attention they've had to the whole cabinet legislative office. Where are they in their machinations in that particular office, or interpretations that might differ from what was a hub of activity during the LDP rule? Are they currently deliberating anything in terms of a collective self-defense interpretation or anything like that?
Okay, Craig.
I'm not sure if anybody else can take a better stab at this, but I actually tried to arrange for some interviews with senior people at the Cabinet Legislation Bureau this summer, and was unsuccessful. I spoke to Richard Samuels, who's written some of the most insightful stuff on the Cabinet Legislation Bureau in English, and he indicated that he hasn't spoken with anyone at the Cabinet Legislation Bureau in some time, and so there's a bit of uncertainty as to where it stands. Now, Richard Samuels had written some time ago that he thought the Cabinet Legislation Bureau had lost some of its power within the sort of political matrix, particularly during the Koizumi years. And that Koizumi had started to get the better of the Cabinet Legislation Bureau. But it's unclear right now with the new government what its political power is, but in the absence of any other information, I think you have to assume that the Cabinet Legislation Bureau's standing and established interpretation continues to be the governing interpretation. And it's part of the Cabinet Legislation Bureau's very strong tradition, much like the Office of Legal Counsel in the United States, that its precedents are binding upon the institution. And so I would hazard that the established interpretation for their purposes continues to be binding.
Chris.
I was going to say almost exactly the same thing. The only thing to add, I think, is I did read some newspaper reports, and this is early on in the DPJ administration, that Ozawa, because of his past run-ins with the Cabinet Legislative Affairs Bureau, was extremely anxious to kind of sit on them and make sure that they didn't exercise the same kind of power that they exercised during the Gulf War. And there's a lot of talk about he didn't like the idea that unelected officials were influencing judgment on constitutional interpretations. But since then, it's gone quiet. So, and as Ozawa's influence has waned somewhat within the party. I mean, he's still influential, but within the actual party hierarchy, the official hierarchy, I would imagine we've defaulted back to a kind of position where the bureaucrats are quite powerful.
Hi, my name is Ria Che. I'm the Wilson Center Junior Scholar. And my question is about what aspects do Japanese policymakers consider when discussing whether Article 9 should be revised or not? Like, against what factors do they evaluate? Is it Japan's actual standing in terms of economic power, military power? Is it its advances in technology? Is it duties and alliance that Japan has to perform? Is it national character of the Japanese, or international reaction? Actually, I was raised in South Korea, and in my school, when we discuss I represent Seoul National University. When we discuss Article 9 of Japan, it's always an issue. It's in the same bunch with the Yasukuni visits, with the historical disputes, territorial disputes. So it's one more indicator. Like if Japan would somehow get rid of Article 9, for South Koreans it would be an indicator that Japan is definitely going back to its militaristic past. It's going back to that path. So to what extent do Japanese policymakers consider that possible reaction in the Asian region? And just one more question, it's a little bit different. What is better for the U.S.? Would it be better if Japan does revise and become a normal country? Or should the U.S. be more kind of concerned about the spirals of tension which would definitely emerge, well, not definitely, depending on your view, may emerge in East Asia if Japan revises Article 9?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to react to in that, and I'm not sure I can speak with great authority. Especially those who support Article 9 have often made this reassurance argument that Article 9 is one of these things which not only is a reflection of Japanese national identity and protects Japan. I actually took this out of my paper because Bryce wanted a shorter paper, so I was trying to tear out various things, and also out of the talk, obviously. But that they want to reassure, not only because they want to prevent themselves from becoming entangled, but they also wanted to reassure their neighbors. One of the things, and I think this is also going to be a little bit of an intra-panel debate here, which has been happening, is that, again, since the end of the Cold War, you've seen a rise of regional security threats. And I think one of the things, and by the way, I mean, Japanese, while I agree with 100% with lots of what Sabina there says, but one of the interesting things is that the threat perceptions are much higher today than they were at almost any point during the Cold War. I mean, when you take a look at the government, the cabinet office data, it shows that the Japanese are much more concerned about, very concerned or somewhat concerned about the possibility of being dragged into a conflict today, and that's been the case since, I'd say, late 1990s, than was true even at the height of the Soviet military buildup. That's kind of interesting when you talk about, what makes, drives public opinion. Is it objective military factors? Well, the objective Soviet capabilities in terms of numbers of missiles, overall, the capacity of the Soviet fleet to disrupt the Japanese sea lines of communication was greater than anything you have yet in East Asia. But I think what's been very disturbing to the Japanese has been the sort of rise of anti-Japanese sentiment, reflected in some of the debates that you talked about. I mean, especially the territorial issues, the history issues. And as a result, I think those people who make that reassurance argument have a much tougher time than they used to. We've been trying, says the Japanese. Now, you can disagree with it, but we've been trying to be Heiwa Kokka Nippon. We've tried to be this peace nation. We've gone through all of these contortions to prevent ourselves from becoming a threat, and still everyone views us as a threat. Or there is all of this hostility. So I think this last part of this argument, Japanese are concerned about spirals of tension. I think there's something to that, but it's a lot less than it used to be. And I think also not only U.S. Security interests, but also Japanese security interests are driving some of the debate. I think we shouldn't overlook this. Japanese population does not, I think, is genuinely attached to so many of the ideals of Article 9. But at the same time, there's a kind of there's a greater pragmaticism there as well, that there are not only security issues of the natural sort, but there are also potentially other kinds of security issues. And I think the Senkaku Gyayudai issues, the East China Sea issues, which we've been seeing recently, the sort of expansion in general in East Asia of maritime pressures, North Korea's continued development of atomic bombs, all of these things are very alarming. I think it was 2004 that poor Tokyo joined a list of cities that Pyongyang threatens to turn into a sea of fire, and this gets noticed. So I think there are lots of things which are driving it.
Greg?
I think that Tom's absolutely right. I mean, the threat perception within Japan is much higher than it was during the Cold War, which is kind of paradoxical. And this is precisely why I think that the left is in denial when it has its head in the sand over Article 9, because they're going to lose the debate. And so they ought to be thinking now about how to fashion Article 9. And I'm not the IR person. I mean, I leave that to Chris and Tom, but it seems to me that the argument could still be made that when you do amend Article 9, it ought to be amended in a way that does not alarm the Koreans or the Chinese or what have you. And it's precisely for that reason that I think that the LDP's proposed amendments are so alarming. So, Article 9, Paragraph 1 under the Jiminto proposal is that the Jie-gun would be entitled to engage in international cooperation activities. Right? This is a phrase that has absolutely no meaning in international law. Right? It's along the lines that Chris talks about, these sort of ingenious devices to obfuscate and hide precisely what is intended. And in my view, the Koreans and the Chinese would be quite rightly alarmed by that language and say, what does that mean? And what it means really, in any sort of legal sense, is that Japan could participate with the United States or any other country in any use of force that constitutes an international activity. Right? It's just cooperation in international activities. It means nothing. And so I think that when Article 9 is amended, it ought to be amended in a way that makes very clear, using international law concepts, precisely what the limitations are. And it could be done in a way that both accounts for Japan's required or need for to defend itself, but at the same time is reassuring. And I think that goes as well to your question about what's better for the United States. I mean, I think, as Sabine and a number of people have said, I mean, a lot of the pressure for amendment to Article 9 comes from the United States and has since Richard Nixon, visited way back when, saying that they'd made a mistake with Article 9. But, you might say that the United States ought to be careful what it wishes for. In a short-term sense, it might be good for the alliance to have Japan able to participate in all kinds of collective self-defense operations, but once the genie is out of the bottle, they might come to regret it.
Sabina, did you want to say anything?
No, I'm
Okay. Chris?
Maybe just one point on the whole question about how Japan's former colonies might respond to something like that, only on the basis of, when you look at the textbook debate, for instance, the history textbook debate, I think Japan has done a lot and yet very little and particularly the Japanese political elite has done very little to get to a better place in terms of acknowledging historical responsibility. And so it's not just about, and that's one of my points, I think it's problematic to focus very narrowly on Article 9 because so many other things are associated with that. And one of those is the colonial legacy of Japan. And as you probably know much better than I do viewed from South Korea, the political elite has gone back and forth about what exactly this war was. And that's 60 years of opportunities lost.
Good. Chris?
Oh, yeah. I suppose I think I kind of agree with what everybody said. I suppose just one observation I'd make is that relatively reassured on this debate about constitutional revision in the sense of, in the past there have been sort of two track. I alluded to this at the start of my presentation in the sense that ideology is one driver. And that's always been a constant driver for certain kinds of policymakers in Japan because they've seen the constitution very much as Japan has to extricate itself from this constitution in order to achieve real proper national identity, and that's still there for some of the key policymakers. But I think the other driver has been this more sort of pragmatic urge to actually try and carve out a sort of actually defend Japan and prevent abandonment by the United States. And also I think there are some ideals in there in terms of trying to contribute more to international society, whatever that is and so on. But I think that it's not simply nationalism which drives this debate. And I suppose one of the relatively encouraging things is that the kind of younger people that are pushing for constitutional revision, whether it's in the DPJ or whether it's in LDP. I mean, there are some, there are some worrying nationalist undertones, people like Abe and so on. But at the same time, it's a relatively constrained kind of nationalism, and a lot of the younger policymakers really do see themselves as kind of more internationalist in outlook. You know, you can kind of disagree with that, but it's not a kind of rampant return to sort of interwar Japanese nationalism. You know, the effort is being led by policymakers who are relatively responsible, I think. So, I mean, but of course, I would say, Japan, of course, needs to guard against that. It does need to think about the perception in the region in terms of what it's doing. And this is where, I very much agree with what Craig is saying, in terms of if we get into the kind of actual policy prescription. I think, I think many Japanese policymakers realize that at the same time as they expand the scope of Japanese security responsibilities, cooperation with the United States, at the same time, they also need to build in some of these formal restrictions as well in terms of what is a geographical scope, how far can Japan use force, what kinds of scenarios are we thinking about. And in that sense, Japan, I think, can reassure its neighbours. I mean, but it has to be very careful. And my biggest fear would be that, Japan gets listens too much to those in the United States who say, kind of just go for it, remove all your restrictions on collective self-defense and so on. And that would be, I think, a kind of Pandora's box. I mean, I think this would be dangerous for Japan, but also, I think, as Craig has alluded to, quite dangerous for the United States, potentially.
I just wanted to amplify one thing which Chris said, which is I think we need to be very first of all, of course, whatever happens is going to come out of the Japanese political system. And if it isn't in Japan's interest and perceived interest, it's not going to be sustainable over time. So we need to appreciate that. The other thing which I think is very important is that in some ways the American analysis of the Japanese self-defense debate got ahead of itself. There was something of a sort of trans-Pacific echo chamber which emerged, I think, at a certain point in time, where, we were saying we'd like you to do this, they were saying they would like us to do this, and then they sort of amplified, and I think we got over-heightened expectations on both sides. And I think in some ways the last couple of years, some of these exaggerated expectations have come back and bit us. I mean, the sort of notion that Japan would take over the role of a sort of Great Britain of the Far East. Well, I understand the argument. I know lots of the people who are making those arguments. Chris, of course, laughs at it because Great Britain, he's from Great Britain, and he thinks that Great Britain isn't quite the ally that we think Great Britain is, but let's put that aside. But I mean, just aside from that, pushed the debate in directions which I think ultimately were unsustainable, and that's something that we need to keep in mind when we talk with our Japanese interlocutors about these issues.
Yonoyama from Mitsui & Company, Japanese multinational. Recently, keyword in Japan is globalization. Because of the past 2 decades of slow growth, another keyword is opening nation. This is the third time to open the nation. And before talking about revising the constitution, the Khan administration launched new national growth plan or something, which envisions combined market with Asia and try to be normal country so that Japan can enjoy integrated Asian market or something. Do you see any sign from that sort of economy-oriented thrust to stimulate the debate for the constitution revision?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, I see a debate. I don't know if it can. For example, Noda, I was just told, met with a lot of business leaders, and they're talking about a number of these issues, including the TPP, not just the East Asian market, the CJK, I think it's being called as one initiative. But I don't think that ties in very much with the constitutional debate right now. And probably, and again, this goes back to the point which I think our friend from Seoul was raising, do economic criteria come into the picture? Well, yes. Obviously Japan, I think Ed Lincoln, for example, and other Japanese economists have also pointed out that something like half of the increase in Japanese economic growth over the last decade has been dependent upon trade with East Asia. And so, anything that Japan does has to be at least constrained to some extent by its impact on its economic relations with its neighbors. But I do have to point out that even at the height of Chinese-Japanese tensions in 2006, and you had these big demonstrations in Beijing and elsewhere, that if you took a look at the trade figures, not much of a change. So, all of these Chinese students were going out and, demonstrating at the Japanese embassy, and were twittering each other on iPhones, which may have been using Japanese technology.
Anybody else?
Well, not twittering, but...
Okay, there was a question down here.
My name's Adam Bates. I'm an intern with the Cato Institute. Professor Martin said a few times that the left needs to essentially recalibrate what it's looking for because they're going to lose the argument. I was curious if any of the panelists could go into what's the source of the opposition on the left. Is it a matter of constitutional adherence where they just believe this is what the Constitution says, or is it a matter of some kind of anti-militarist or pacifist principle?
Well, I mean, I'll take the first stab. I mean, and I do come at this more from a legal perspective, and I think Tom and Chris probably, and certainly Sabine, would come at it from the sociological and more from the political perspective. But my sense is it's both of those things, right? I mean, there is this sort of, I hate to use the word dogmatic, but almost a dogmatic adherence to the original sort of interpretation of Article 9. But coupled with that is a sort of pragmatic concern that once the process of amendment begins, Article 9 is just going to get gutted. And so there's just this sort of sense of denial, or, I mean, to be more charitable, a position that if we just hold fast, we will be able to, as Tom alluded to, time and time again, the opportunity has come and gone for amendment. It will come and go yet again, and we will. But I actually think that, increasingly, even if there is no amendment, the left should be concerned about what Chris has described as this slow erosion of the normative power of Article 9. I mean, over time, from a purely legal and constitutional perspective, when a provision of the Constitution comes to get hollowed out in this way, it bleeds through to the other provisions of the Constitution, right? It starts to undermine the normative power of the constitutional order altogether. And, just as an example, when the Nagoya High Court in 2008 held that the deployment of Iraqi forces, or of the Jihadi to Iraq, constituted a use of force in violation of Article 9, notwithstanding that they dismissed the claim on standing grounds. They in Obiter held that the deployment constituted a use of force. The response of the government was quite astounding, right? One of the senior commanders of the Jihadi flatly contradicted and undermined the opinion of the court, which, given Japan's militaristic history, was cause for serious concern. The government, the cabinet secretary, dismissed the decision out of hand. Those are developments that, in my view, sort of call into question the commitment to the rule of law, and it's precisely because of this hollowing out of Article 9. So I think the left ought to be concerned and be starting to say, look, we should be getting behind the amendment bus, but coming forth with more progressive proposals for how to amend Article 9 in ways that remain consistent with the spirit of Article 9, but address the very legitimate self-defense concerns of the right.
I also have to agree in part, and I'll go add something to what Greg said, but I think that the way in which defense policy has been made, which has been partly imposed by the contortions involving Article 9, but not only, has been very unhealthy. And that has reinforced the sense that the Japanese population is not really in control of important decisions that affect their interests. I think also, there's a sort of more fundamental questions. Where do these attitudes come from, and how do they stay over time? We used to always argue that you had a whole generation of people who were traumatized by the experience of World War II, and if you went through the fire bombings, and you had people who starved to death and whose lives were wasted miserably in Guadalcanal and the islands in the Pacific and so forth. These kinds of memories are searing and can have an effect on people. Well, how many people are left of that generation? Hardly any. But these stories are preserved on multiple levels in Japanese society. I mean, some of my friends have spoken to me sort of movingly about how when you do hakamairi, right, and some of the older people go and visit the graves, the traditional, and you visit the graves of members of the family who died in World War II, and you have this business, little Shintaro got into a good school this year, and the family's doing well, and your efforts were not in vain. You did not just have a dog's death kind of inonoshi kind of thing. And this is very moving and very powerful, and this has been reinforced by the ways in which this gets picked up in popular culture. If you take a look at, if you look at read Miyazaki movies or watch Godzilla, right, and look at the kind of message you get about the uselessness or even pernicious effects of the military. It's reinforced by movies, it's reinforced by manga, and it's reinforced by politicians who talk about the past in a particular way. So this then takes on the elements of not just experience, that trauma has been to a certain extent institutionalized in the culture of the country and is shifting slowly, but has a great deal of effect. And I think that lots of the emotional power, and there is a powerful emotional power of the commitment of many people, not only on the progressive left, but more broadly in the Japanese population, comes from the existence of those memories in Japan.
I just wanted to add one thing. I mean, I just think if you go back to the history of the ratification of Article 9, I think it's fascinating the extent to which there was an embrace of the pacifist principles in Article 9, and sort of as a bookend to Sabine's sort of narrative of the manga and how misplaced that effort has been. In the wake of the promulgation of the Constitution, the government sent little booklets about the Constitution to every household in Japan, and it managed in a very, very short period of time to mobilize a great deal of support for the pacifist principles. And you can see in this process how a provision of a Constitution gives rise to constitutive norms that become the source of a national identity. And so it's in part a fear of losing that sense of national identity through a revision of Article 9, I think, that is driving the left as well.
Maybe one last word on the left. I think, as in most countries, the left is very frustrating in so far as and in Japan probably just more so than in some other places, that it refuses to think about certain institutions, about certain scenarios. I remember, to indulge myself for a second, when I started my research on the military, I did very different work before that, and whenever I talk to an academic as well as people you meet in restaurants or bars and so on, when I told them what I work on, the first desire of people was to find out whether I'm a militarist, because that's the only thing they could imagine would motivate me to work on the military. And of course, this is very, very strong in the academy, where I think it's a combination of not just trauma, but sort of the easy alliance of the left with an anti-war and anti-militarism that then becomes black-boxed and sort of robs them of the ability to make a good argument for it. And you can talk to any teacher in Japan, and I've spoken to some who would say, well, either we don't even teach about World War II, that would sort of form the basis for an anti-militarism or pacifism, or all we teach is that war is terrible. And of course war is terrible, but a current generation in particular who does not have the kind of memories, and even not grandparents who have the memories, who shared and shared those, it's fairly meaningless. And I think the left in Japan has largely failed in filling that void with meaning.
Okay, Mr. Fukuda.
Thank you. Nobuo Fukuda, here at the Wilson Center. Could I invite comments from the panel on what exactly you think will happen if Japan scraps Article 9, say, within a few years, regardless of the probability? What changes will be brought to Japan's political landscape or the regional security environment in East Asia Pacific do you expect?
You can have a go, Chris.
So I'm not sure I quite caught the first part of the question. So if Article 9 changes, what will happen?
Well,
Scrap.
scrap.
Okay.
What I meant by scrapping was just eliminating
Right.
the three key elements that Dr. Martin touched on.
Right. So what would the scenario look like in terms of Japan as a security actor in the region?
Probably,
Yeah.
well, theoretically, Japan
Right.
could go to war to settle international disputes at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a possibility. So, I mean, if we again, I tried to sketch out the three scenarios. The first scenario is the kind of total, just basically take the manacles off, and revision national security law, which enables collective self-defense. And so Japan really emerges as a I don't like the word, but sort of normal, so-called normal military power. And therefore, I think the kind of scenario is that Japan becomes a normal ally, and a normal ally from the U.S. perspective is an ally. Not when you get in a fight, it doesn't just say, "Well, I'll hold your coat for you." It actually says, I'll come in with you. So I mean, this would be the kind of U.S. expectation. So that would be the kind of one scenario where I think you would see the pushing ahead of integration of U.S. and Japanese military strategies, interoperability, and a Japanese, whether the will is there or not to do, but nevertheless at least in terms of constitutional freedoms to do it, an ability to engage in combat and to prepare for war fighting. I mean, I think that's one scenario, but I think the second scenario I tried to sketch out is a slightly more intermediate one where Japan takes away some of the restrictions, recognizes de facto realities and so on, but at the same time as possibly edging towards collective self-defense, nevertheless, and opening up possibilities for cooperation with the United States. There's also the possibility of expanded cooperation with the United Nations, which may, to some extent, balance Japan's commitment to the United States and give Japan an alternative avenue for the disposal of its military power, under UN mandates, which then may lead to sort of more, not a role in war fighting, but more kind of role in more reconstruction, sort of post-conflict reconstruction, that kind of role. And when it comes to the alliance, there may be more types of. At the same time as some cooperation is expanded, nevertheless there'll be a range of sort of clearer, if you like, sort of firewalls built in to Japanese military cooperation with the United States, which will say, well, we'll do this, but we won't do this. We'll do this. We don't do this. So Japan will be able to sort of establish some kind of breaks on just how far it will go with the United States. So I think that's probably a more kind of intermediate position, sort of maybe do a bit more with the UN, a bit more with the United States, but nevertheless, constitutional revision doesn't mean a free-for-all. It means actually an expanded military role, but at the same time, a kind of more circumscribed military role in certain ways.
Chris is answering it in great detail. Just three distinctions. One is what would it mean for Japanese military capabilities? I don't think Japan would increase its defense spending or its military capabilities very much right now. I mean, this whole scenario is that Japan collectively wakes up tomorrow and says, this Article 9 debate, enough already, okay, and just for no other reason just scraps it, right? Because we're not imagining any other kinds of conditions except that. So I don't think there would be much change in defense spending. Would there be a change in military missions? I think along the lines of what Chris is saying. It'll become easier. But again, I don't think Japan's going to start doing a lot more than it already is. The key issue is perceptions. How is this going to be perceived in Japan and in the region and in the United States? And in that case, I think some of Japan's neighbors are going to get very nervous. And I think the U.S. would try very hard to especially reassure South Korea, because South Korea and Japan we would really like, and I think there's a broad understanding among many circles, that South Korea, Japan, the United States need to work a lot more on these kinds of issues. I don't know whether there's much we could do to reassure the Chinese, who anyway spend about, at this point, 3 to 4 times as much as the Japanese do on defense anyway. And then, of course, I think the one thing is the U.S. shouldn't get carried away again, as I suggested earlier. I mean, that we, again, sort of suddenly expect, oh, Japan is going to be a normal nation. I have never known what a normal nation is. I have never met a normal nation. Every country, including the United States, perhaps especially the United States, is abnormal in its own way. And and we should not simply assume that, oh, the Japanese are going to think just the way we do about national security and follow our interests because they've now gotten rid of Article 9. And that would be the one note of caution I would have.
I just say from a legal perspective, I mean, this wasn't the thrust of your question, but I mean, if Japan scrapped Article 9, I mean, it has to be understood that Japan's constitutional order is understood to rest on 3 pillars: human rights, popular sovereignty, and pacifism. And so to scrap Article 9 would be to really take out one of the 3 pillars of the Japanese constitutional order. And that would have significant, I think, repercussions in terms of, again, as Tom says, perception. It would be difficult to reconcile with the current Japanese sense of identity, of national identity, right? I mean, even if nothing immediately changed, it would have the impact of taking away this notion of Japan as a pacifist country in which there is a pacifist principle built into the Constitution. And on this idea of normal country, which is a term that Ozawa in particular, I think, sort of threw around in the 1990s, I'd echo what Tom says. I mean, Germany has similar constraints built into its constitution. The German Constitutional Court has actually handed down decisions requiring that there be approval of the Bundestag for any deployment of armed forces. In the wake of the Iraq War, the United Kingdom, Australia, Spain, a number of countries have started looking at developing greater legislative control over executive decisions to use force. So I actually quibble with the idea that Japan is not a normal country because of Article 9.
I'm Ben Self, at present unaffiliated institutionally. I first off wanted to thank you all. It's a wonderful panel, and it's a great treat to have so many experts with so much wisdom to share with us. I wanted then to sort of quibble with the notion that Japan shouldn't be normal, or first point is to attack that question of whether normal is a useful or useless way of thinking about Japan's international security role. And Ozawa obviously used it because of the Gulf War trauma. And the Gulf War was a particular case where normal countries participated. We had a clear UN mandate, and a huge coalition of countries participated. Japan put up $13 billion, which meant that Japan accepted the inherent legitimacy of the operation and just said, don't get my hands dirty. I can't do what I know is the right thing to do. I know the international community should do this. I'm constrained myself so that I can't participate. That's abnormal for the international community. I think Ozawa was right to take that term in order to recast this, to make Japan a country that isn't constraining itself in such a way. Now, why does Japan constrain itself? What is the point of having that wall, as opposed to a set of policies, a set of tools, a set of systems? And I think Dr. Martin's suggestion of legislative approval before dispatch is perfectly appropriate for the Japan case. But why set up this wall except to contain a monster? And I think it's really unfortunate that the Japanese left and the international community presumes that Japan remains fundamentally monstrous. That the Japanese, if they weren't constrained by this wall, would become a dangerous actor in the international community, would be not only revisionist, but would be rapists, would immediately engage in vicious and horrible invasions of neighboring countries once again. That's the implicit assumption behind Article 9. Japan cannot be trusted. The Japanese can never be trusted. And to give to the sovereign Japanese state the same legitimacy of other sovereign states in the international system would be a mistake, because Japan's proven in the past that its use of force is irresponsible, although, of course, the U.S., to my mind, has proven that in the much more recent past. So we have no, I think, fundamental moral basis to say to the Japanese, oh, well, you somehow are different from the rest of humanity. You have some special characteristic that makes your use of force inherently illegitimate. So coming from what I think is a very similar pacifist or pro-pacifist viewpoint, I completely turn this around. I think the creation of that monster, the maintenance of that image of a monster, undermines the trust of neighboring countries and is exploited almost as if Japan is a dog on a chain and the U.S. to some extent holds the chain, to say, watch out, this crazy Japan might come unchained if you Koreans, Chinese, or so forth don't behave yourselves. It's an outdated. I'm not saying it wasn't appropriate in the post-war era, during the Cold War, for Japan to focus on entirely internal things and abjure the use of force, but that's a long time ago, and now we're at the point where Japanese democracy should be considered at least as trustworthy as any other advanced industrial democracy.
I agree with you. Except the one thing I will quickly add is, look, two things. Okay, first of all, I don't think the Japanese are increasingly, you're just putting back some of the argument which I used to make myself. So thanks, Ben. I still feel like a personal echo chamber here. But I mean, look, the Japanese fear of the Japanese monster has declined a great deal. I mean, it used to be my friends in the self-defense forces didn't go in public with uniforms because people would hassle them. Not any longer. The image of the self-defense forces is pretty good at this point. Externally, it used to, and it's, there was a good historical basis. I mean, Japan took over all of Asia, and until a few years ago, Japan was at least potentially the strongest military power in the region, and still potentially very strong militarily. But not any longer. And in fact, the problem is, the way the Russians are pushing the Japanese around on some issues, I was speaking with some Russian experts just the other day, is intimidation. They don't think the Japanese are serious. They think they're basically punks. And they can push them around. The Chinese have some of this attitude too. In some ways, Japan is not viewed as a monster enough. And every once in a while, Charles Krauthammer and some other U.S. People want to, commentators say we should threaten the Chinese by saying we might give the Japanese nukes. They hope to revive that image for U.S. purposes, but I don't think it's very credible. The other point about who's normal. Look, I mean, I look at who are the countries I look at. I mean, the Germans with their insane obsession with rules and institutions, are they normal? Are the French with their completely off-the-wall Gallic prickliness and their sort of deep need to poke their thumbs in our eyes at every opportunity, are they normal? Are the Brits, I'm sorry, with their almost slavish and delusional idea that by following the United States they can play Greeks to our Rome, right, and the special friendship. And as for the U.S., with our messianic approach to the world, amerikanischen Wesen soll die Welt genesen, we're going to rebuild the world. Some of the German speakers here so smile. I mean, we've been pretty delusional as well. So everybody's delusional in their own way. And the question is, are those delusions, and they're necessary and unavoidable. Then the question is, are the existing set of delusions more or less functional? I think the Ozawa's argument is that some of Japan's delusions around the time of the Gulf War were dysfunctional for Japan. And to become normal, and he used it, I think, in a very sort of pragmatic and calculated way, was just a way of trying to push the Japanese set of delusions in a more useful way from his point of view.
So, from a legal perspective, I would still resist the label of abnormal, but I would concede that there is an inconsistency in the Article 9 prohibition on participation in collective security operations that have been authorized by the United Nations. And that's why I said Article 9 is overly inclusive or overly exclusive, depending on how you look at it. to the extent that it is an attempt to incorporate international law principles. And so this is why I say that I think there should be a healthy debate as to whether Japan should be able to participate in international collective security operations authorized by the United Nations. And interestingly enough, this was a debate that animated the ratification process, because members of both the lower and upper house and the Privy Council during the ratification said, but isn't Article 9 as it's being presented to us, and they didn't know that the Americans had drafted it at that point, going to preclude us from participating? And in fact, isn't it going to cause us to be in violation of Article 43 of the UN Charter when it comes time for us to join? And the interlocutors from the cabinet said, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. The Americans will take care of it. As it turns out, Article 43 of the UN Charter never gets implemented in the way that it was anticipated. There's not a requirement of states to contribute forces, so Japan is not, as it stands, in violation of any obligation. But you're quite right that it can be seen as not complying with its responsibilities in a collective security system. But also it should be pointed out that at that point in time, during the ratification process, members of both houses embraced the idea that Japan would be at the vanguard of a new movement in sort of international relations, in which the UN system would create this sort of peaceful order, and Japan was really blazing the way. Now, clearly that hasn't come to pass, and so it is entirely appropriate to look back, for them to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, perhaps we ought to be engaging in collective security operations. But I think that sort of stands in tension with your idea that, at least for the Japanese themselves, that they view themselves as a monster that needs to be kept on a chain. I mean, they actually, some of them saw themselves as being at the vanguard of a pacifist movement that somehow just hasn't come to pass. And so I agree that Article 9 could be revised to allow collective security operations, but then the question is, do you then also permit collective self-defense, right, which is a unilateral use of force? Pearl Harbor was an act of self-defense, it will be remembered, right? I mean, self-defense is a very pliable notion. The invasion of Iraq was an exercise in self-defense. And so Asian neighbors have some reason to be skeptical about Japan being entitled to exercise self-defense. And particularly, the LDP hasn't done the Japanese any favors by using, what Chris calls these devious mechanisms, right? So even in its Article 9 amendment proposal, when it uses phrases like international cooperation activities, that sets off alarms. People are going, what does that mean? I mean, is this not a pretext for something else? And so I think, as Sabine has said, there have been missed opportunities where Japan could have, quote unquote, become more normal by simply fessing up and saying precisely what it intended to do and why.
Okay, great. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for making us all a little bit more intelligent. And see you next.